Thank you, and welcome to the last of today's panels. Veronica is going to present the main subject. Before she does that, before I ask her to do so, I wanted to actually remark on a very strange shift that has happened, especially in recent weeks. Our sort of views of imperialism, which have been, in a way, verified in real time. But let's not forget that this view of imperialism was not in the mainstream for a very long time. In fact, it was actually delegitimized, seen as the property of the losers of history, people who complained about imperialism. Now we can see its workings in real time. I say this because I remember when I first came to Europe in the mid-90s and used to go to bookshops in London. I was very struck by the number of books with titles such as How Britain Made the Modern World. There was even a How Scotland Made the Modern World. The production of these books became more hectic in the run-up and afterwards, after the Iraq War, where America was suddenly supposed to make the modern world. And the same people who were saying how Britain made the modern world were saying America now should make the modern world, of course neglecting to ask, if Britain did such a great job, why did America now need to make the modern world? And I was very struck by those because growing up in India, in a post-colonial country, our view of history was that the world had been unmade by Britain, and large parts of it had been rendered really, literally uninhabitable. It was not only the practice of systematic violence or genocide, but a certain mode of extraction, a certain mode of capitalism, allied with the powers of technology, military techniques, that made this imperialism the most destructive and the most violent in the history of imperialisms. Of course, there had been imperialisms in the past, but not with this kind of power. And this critique was obviously not unique to Indians. It was shared very extremely widely. It existed in the writings, in the thought of writers, activists in China, that's Liang Qichao or Jamaluddin al-Afghani, any number of people, Jose Carlos Mariátegui. There's just so many people around the world who experienced imperialism as a great violation of their societies, of their philosophical outlooks, of their spiritual faith. And I think that view, which was sidelined, which was marginalized, has now emerged into the mainstream. And that is a very interesting shift. We've been talking about perception and conversion. And I think that's another of those conversions happening right now, that it's been impossible to interpret so much of what is happening today without relying upon this analytical framework that was established in the non-Western parts of the world in the late 19th century, which is a particular view of imperialism. Veronica.
Well, thank you very much, Pankaj, and thank you again for the CCB again. Yes, I was thinking that at least in Argentina, I don't know in other countries of Latin America, there is a very popular joke that is that the only country in which you couldn't have a coup d'etat is in USA. Why? Because they do not have USA embassy. So this is for us the popular common sense in a joke that now it is very much widespread, I think. I don't know if in Colombia it is the same, but well, I have a very brief text in order to open up the conversation that is called Making Fascism at Home. That is the title of a book that I am writing right now. And in this sense, I am also remembering how during the era of dictatorships in the Southern Cone, in Argentina in particular, in the 70s, the United States imperialist and counterinsurgency strategy was characterized by the idea of using our region, Latin America, as a backyard. And the internal conflict was directed against the revolutionary struggles on that time. In the case of Argentina, the dictatorship itself sought to exploit anti-imperialist, attempted to exploit anti-imperialist sentiment to gain domestic legitimacy during the Malvinas War with England. We learned from mothers and abuelas, from mothers and grandmothers, madres y abuelas, as I was commenting yesterday of Plaza de Mayo, that it was necessary to condemn the war and fight against the dictatorship at the same time. So for me, it's a very important moment because, well, at that, in the 80s, when the dictatorship was weak, they attempted to re-legitimize themselves through the Malvinas War. And it was very important to maintain this double level of rejection to the dictatorship and to the war at the same time. And I think that maybe it could be useful to think if it is still correct to conceptualize our third world regions as a backyard of USA. Maybe we can argue that they are playing a different role now, a front yard of economic experimentation. So I am trying to, well, think together what kind of political topography we can discuss if we are thinking in our regions not as a backyard, rather a front yard. And in what sense could be useful to think about a front yard of economic experimentation? Today, the strategy of power is clear: generate a fascisation. I think that is a very weird word, fascisation. But for me, it's interesting to underline the process of fascisation and not just to discuss about the notion of fascism, but how we are witnessing different processes of fascisation. And I think it's more interesting to analyze and to discuss those processes in terms of how fascism is developed from below. So generate a fascisation from below, I think it is part of produce this idea of that the only relationship among people is cruelty and violence. And we were discussing already that, but I think it's a crucial point. New forms of competition, inequality stand against intersectional strategies of solidarity, while the most concentrated powers appear to be untouchable. So we have this horizontal competition, this idea of winning lives and non-winning lives that Camila was mentioning. And on the other side, these very much concentrated powers as something very untouchable. So fascisation attempts to solve different forms of plunder and exploitation by producing the idea of individual responsibility in the midst of the structural disposition process. Financial devices, especially through debt, external debt and household debt, expand new forms of recolonization of everyday life and are proposed as a personal solution against impoverishment. But also credit, if you have the access to credit, is this way of, noticing that your life could be a winning life. So this form of making fascism at home also has a counter-revolutionary strategy. It responds against dynamics that have created spaces, tactics, and forms of accompaniment to make bodies and territories stronger and less vulnerable to exploitation, and also to make vulnerability as a common ground to share other strategies in the level of social reproduction. I think that this form of making fascism at home is also a way to devalorize all that emerge as part of a common, to depreciate all that can produce other forms of support, belonging, and care. There is another important connection. In our countries, the ultra-right is also trying to enforce a renewal of what is called internal colonialism. That is an important concept of the first coined by the Mexican sociologist Pablo González Casanova, but then, for example, reworked by Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui in Bolivia. This is a way of governance through the deployment of an internal war against certain populations to assert the position of colonial subordination. Milei can celebrate Trump and say that he is the most Zionist president in the world as a way to legitimize his national austerity policies with the chainsaw against pensionate disabled people, public universities, feminist collectives, and workers. And this is, I think, the landscape of sacrifice that we were discussing yesterday. Who will be the next sacrifice population? I think that we have to talk about the invasion of Venezuela and how it kick-started a new fascist moment in Latin America. Nowadays, for example, there is a discussion about how the invasion of Venezuela ensured that oil flows like a prerequisite for Iran invasion in terms of resources and strategy, and reinforce the blockade against Cuba. Meanwhile, with the fight against narco-terrorism in the region using USA military forces and under the umbrella of a new Shield of the Americas initiative, they are updating the imperial traditions targeting new internal enemies. Faced with leaders like Milei and Trump, who declare they can do whatever they want, whenever they want. It could be a financial scam. It is the case of Milei, genocide or invasion. A fierce struggle is unfolding over the power to act. So I think that this led us with the question about how do we cultivate a capacity to stop cruelty that is also an ability to protect against fascist dreams of annihilation. Where does possibility dwell? Again, quoting the poet, for communities of the future. How can we activate memories of disobedience? I want to finish talking about that 2 weeks ago in Argentina, a labor reform was passed that rolls back labor rights more than a century, pushed by Milei's government under the banner of labor modernization. I think that the notion of modernization in our countries is still an important legacy of imperialism. And it, for example, now we will have working days of 12 hours. It suspends caregiving leaves and classifies, for example, certain illness as voluntary. So, for example, if you have diabetes, cancer, or depression, it is your responsibility because you did not take care enough. So this idea of a reform of labor is even further. It's a reform of the idea of working day, of rest, of, life, in fact. I think that for us, it was also very much important that after the reform was passed by Parliament, that is with this institutional defeat in our back, we called to the feminist strike on March 8th. And I think it was very important to have a place where the anger and the fury have a space. So the call that we made, it was like a collective call to disobey the reform in each place. And I think that it was very much important also because we discuss the connection between the labor reform and the modification of glacier protection law, because the labor reform is very much connected with a neo-extractivist agenda of the government, but also to the penal, very punitive reform that is lowering the age of criminal responsibility for minors to 14 years. So I am willing to discuss how, for example, a concept like radical reformism or revolutionary reforms that I think those were concepts that in the certain left were part of a vocabulary. Now, the ultra-right is capturing this idea of radical reform. And they are not just changing law, they are reorganizing and reshaping society through this notion of cruelty. But at the same time, how different movements are acting during these reforms and are reinventing how we call to disobey in concrete terms. Thank you.
Would you like to say something also about this other experience that you know about the backyard of US imperialism?
Yeah, well, I was thinking, Pankaj, thank you, everybody involved in having me here. It's a huge pleasure for me to be sharing this panel with these people and to be talking with you guys. I was thinking, Veronica, about something that I discussed with Pankaj when we had an interview for your extraordinary magazine, the new Equator. I said, answering to a question of yours, that before the invasion of Venezuela, Venezuela had been probably one of 3 or 4 countries in the whole of Latin America that hadn't been invaded by the US. And I started thinking about this.
Because it had no US embassy there.
Probably. But you know, if we take what we now call the Bad Bunny plan of South America, Argentina was invaded in the 70s, Chile in 73. The military dictatorship was aided by the US. So did the Brazilian dictatorship in 64. Bolivia was invaded too. Colombia started the whole thing in 1903. I don't know if you know this, but Panama used to belong to Colombia. La Gran Colombia. And in 1903, it wanted to separate, but it did so with the military aid of the United States. 5 years before the war in Cuba, La Guerra de Cuba, it's called in Spain, it has a different name in the US, was so traumatizing for Spain because it lost its colonies that a whole literary generation was named after this, the 98 generation, the generation of 1898. So you can draw a history of the 20th century through American invasions or intentions to invade, to attack the expansion of communism, to defend or protect fascist military dictatorships, or to protect American economic interests, such as the overthrow of the Guatemalan government in the 1950s, to protect the economic interests of the United Fruit Company. There is that history of imperialism in America during the 20th century up until now. Venezuela is the last instance in that, but it's different. And this is what I try to discuss, what we try to discuss, and what I would like to bring to the table. In a sense, what communism was during the Cold War as a pretext for invasion or intervention or manipulation of elections or coup d'etat or governments. In a sense, what communism was during the Cold War, the drug wars are now. Drug trafficking is now the main pretext US governments have to intervene in the internal politics of Latin American governments, and this my country has suffered for a very long time. The drug wars have been going on for 50 years, more or less. The DEA was founded in 1973. It has about my age, 1973. And since then, the fight against drug trafficking has been the way American governments have found to control Latin American politics, particularly in producing countries such as mine. So we have this absurd figure of certification, which means that the country which is the biggest cocaine consumer or one of the biggest cocaine consumers in the world tells the producing country that if you don't behave well in trying to control the trade, we will sanction you. And this has happened. More or less the same thing happened at the end of last year when we all watched boats being bombed in the middle of the Caribbean in what was effectively extrajudicial killings of foreign citizens who may or may not have been carrying drugs. I think they were, because I know how the trade works. But it doesn't matter. What matters is the lack of due process. What matters is the administration of a death penalty for foreign citizens without due process. And what matters is the excuse this situation gave to the Trump administration to bring the aircraft carriers further towards South America, to the Caribbean coasts. When the invention of January the 3rd happened, we all realized the reason behind that strategy. We haven't been able to really figure out if Maduro was captured because this was a failed socialist government or because he was a drug dealer. So both things intertwine in the kind of pretexts that have been put forward by the Trump administration for this kind of intervention, which was about neither socialism nor drugs. It was about oil. So there is this new brand of imperialism that has to do with a change of pretext. Now drugs used as communism was used before. And this is part, I think, of what we should try to discuss. Veronica brought the question of cruelty to the table. I'm very glad she did. I have several things to say about this, but maybe for another round of questions.
Shall we turn to Adaf? I mean, I'm, listening to you, Juan, and Veronica, I'm again thinking something Kamala said about, that period in the 1990s. Given this long history and very sordid history, using communism as a pretext, drugs as a pretext now, occasionally it's promotion of freedom and democracy, how is it that imperialism disappeared as a meaningful concept to make sense of the way the world is structured today? Global economies, global politics. How is it that we lost sight of this really important way to understand the way in which the world has been made and unmade? The way in which, for instance, is there any way you can understand China's behavior today? Or Iran's behavior, for instance, without understanding the role imperialism played in these societies, the way it shaped their responses to the modern world. That's something I want to bring up with Adaf because, like myself, she also grew up in a post-colonial country, our respective countries shared certain visions of what a post-imperial or what a post-colonial state should be or ought to be like. And somehow at some point or other, that vision was lost. There was very interesting reasons why that happened. But yeah, I'd love to know what you think of this sort of strange omission.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Let me first start by thanking you for inviting me to this gathering. It's really been extraordinary yesterday and today, and I would also just like to send a big salam to our friends in Doha, particularly Dean Safwan, of course, and it's a big disappointment not to be with them, but maybe next time, inshallah. Yeah, so I'll just say that you've now guided me a bit, but I almost had no idea what I was going to say, because the day before yesterday, I did have an idea. And then listening to everybody yesterday and today, I found so many points of, of conversions, points where people are talking about things that worried me is an understatement, that have practically paralyzed me for the last several months. So there, I've found myself responding to so many things and finding so much similarity. I mean, Nisreen talking about the revolution in Sudan and the revolutions across the Arab world. You're talking about cruelty and about creating fascism from below, and various others. But then a combination of what you're saying now and sorry, doesn't matter. Thank you. What Father Antonio was talking about, obviously he was talking about many things, but talking about the ability to imagine something different. And of course, that keeps coming up, especially if you are supposed to be a writer of fiction, which you, in my case, have failed to do for 20 years because of doing other things, or hijacking yourself into other things. But this business of imagining, seeing different possibilities and imagining different worlds, and then Pankaj talks about our post-colonial societies. So what I am actually going to do is I am going to offer you 2 moments in Egyptian history that speak to this issue of different worlds or different possibilities. The first one is from the post-colonial society, and it's a bit of a cheat because this is from a book I wrote ages ago, and which I will now read 2 paragraphs from. And it's even got a little diagram about what growing up Egyptian in the 60s meant. These are all the areas into which being Egyptian opened up. So it says growing up Egyptian in the 60s meant growing up Muslim, Christian, Egyptian, Arab, African, Mediterranean, non-aligned, socialist, but happy with small-scale capitalism. On top of that, if you were urban, professional, the chances were that you spoke English and or French and danced to the Stones as readily as to Abd al-Halim. In Cairo, on any one night, you could go see an Arabic, English, French, Italian, or Russian film. One week, the Russian Hamlet was playing at Cinema Odeon, Christopher Plummer's Hamlet at Cinema Asr al-Nil, and Karam Mutawa's Hamlet at the Egyptian National Theatre. We were modern and experimental. We believed in art and science. We cared passionately for freedom and social justice. We saw ourselves as occupying a ground common to both Arab and Western culture. Russian culture was in there too, and the Indian subcontinent, and a lot of South America. The question of identity as something that needed to be defined and defended did not occupy us. We were not looking inward at ourselves, but outward at the world. We knew who we were, or thought we did. In fact, I never came across the Arabic word for identity, huwiyya, until long after I was no longer living full-time in Egypt. Looking back, I imagine our 60s identity as a spacious meeting point, a common ground with avenues into the rich hinterlands of many traditions. This territory, this ground, valued precisely for being a meeting point for many cultures and traditions, let's call it mezza terra, was not invented or discovered by my generation, but we were the first to be born into it, to inhabit it as of right. It was a territory imagined, created even, by Arab thinkers and reformers starting in the middle of the 19th century and then carrying on for a couple of pages until what Edward Said describes, what distinguished the great liberationist cultural movements that stood against Western imperialism was that they wanted liberation within the same universe of discourse inhabited by Western culture. One extra, little garnish here, or add, the rewards of inhabiting the mezza terra are enormous. At its best, it endows each thing at the same moment with the shine of the new, the patina of the old. The language, the people, the landscape, the food of one culture constantly reflected of another. This is not a process of comparison. To go back to the idea of the chessboard versus the fabric. This is not a process of comparison, not a which is better than which project, but rather at once a distillation and an enrichment of each thing, each idea. It means, for example, that you are both on the inside and the outside of language, that within each culture, your stance cannot help but be both critical and empathetic. So that was one worldview, which of course I discovered coming to live in England and living there and being part of that society that I discovered was completely not shared, and lived with that. But it was real enough for us until again it was pretty much destroyed later. The other moment that I want to offer you from Egypt is from 4,000 years ago. And it is a moment in which, so Egyptian history, ancient Egyptian history, is traditionally divided into three sections: the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. So we will ignore whatever, obviously there are revisionist views of this, and there's also a view. I'm hesitant to speak of ancient Egypt at this moment because there is, talking about neo-fascism, there is a trend in Egypt to glorify ancient Egypt at the expense of, we're Egyptians, we're not Arabs. Forget about Arabs, forget about Palestine, forget about empire, forget about Islam, we are Kemites. So, but I assume there are no Kemites here, so it's okay. I'm not lending myself to the Kemitian version of the world. So the Old Kingdom died. It vanished, and with it, for various reasons, but with it went the ideas that had sustained it, the things that people believed that made it possible to be a coherent and cohesive community, and be successful. And it was followed by about 350 years of what is called Asr al-Idmihlal, or the time, the first intermediate, the time of disruption, or the time of the nations, if you want to not valorize centralization. But it was all pulled together again, and it became the Middle Kingdom, which was a very successful 1,000-year project with great agricultural, irrigation, trade, and so on. In other words, not military. There was a moment when people had to decide what were the values that were going to replace the old values. So basically, through military endeavors, the country was pulled together again and became one state. But how was that going to hold? It needed the minds and the hearts of the people to believe in something. And it was no longer possible to believe in the old ideas of the divinity of pharaoh, and so on. And to be very sort of like brief and superficial, what happened was that 3 new ideas were brought in. And they were not like against, they were again, as the last panelist spoke about, the possibility of conversion as almost a continuation, but a continuation with radical changes. So instead of it being only the king who was subject to judgment after death and therefore having everlasting life, it became everybody. So everybody became accountable. And that was a democratization of religion, which meant that you were accountable and also that you had the possibility of immortality, of everlasting life. That was one. The other was a constitution, that basically what you hear about as the story of al-fallah al-fasih, the eloquent peasant, was essentially a constitution that was a literary artifact where the speech was put into the mouth of this, not only a peasant, but a peasant from an oasis. In other words, from the most marginal of society, the most marginal sector of society, a poor peasant from an oasis who is coming into the city to sell his stuff and gets attacked and beaten up and robbed by the son of the mayor of the district he's passing through. And so he stands, this is the literary imagination, he stands there and he delivers a speech to the king about how this has happened, how this is allowed to happen, what the king should do, and how the king should run the country, and so on. And the story says that the king hears that this is happening and orders his men to not go anywhere near the peasant, but to provide food and drink for his family so they don't starve, while the guy carries on with his eloquent drawing up of a constitution. And that becomes the document that is used to teach scribes reading and writing for the next, beyond the Middle Kingdom, actually, well into the New Kingdom. So that is the constitution. The third element, and that's the last thing I'm going to say, but it's crucial, is the adoption of the principles of Ma'at. Some of you will know who Ma'at is, some won't. She is spelled M-A-A-T, and she is a principal who is always represented as a tall, slim woman with a feather coming up from her crown. Now, this feather is what is used to weigh the hearts of the dead in the last judgment. So you come before Osiris and your heart is placed on the scale, and on the other side of the scale there is the feather of Ma'at. And you need to be able to say, to announce truthfully, some say 42, some say 84 principles of Ma'at. I'm obviously not going to recite them, but I will give you a little bit of them. Obviously, they have all the 10 commandments. I did not kill, but also I did not cause the killing of anyone. I did not cause the shedding of tears. I did not speak or act in anger. I enjoyed the tenderness of my mother and respected my father. I joined in the public holidays and offered sacrifices, not more or less than any other person. I did not eavesdrop. I did not move the boundary of my land against my neighbors in the night, and so on and so on. A whole list of behaviors. And notice that none of them is about what I believe. They're all about how I act towards other people. And the thing is that Ma'at had existed forever. She's there in the very first texts we get from 3500 BC, but it was assumed that everybody knew what Ma'at was. So they would say the king speaks Ma'at, the king acts Ma'at, but they didn't unpackage it. It was rather like talking about love or friendship. So it was there as a concept. And what they did at the beginning of the Middle Kingdom, somehow, is they unpackaged the concept of mat into these 42 rules. And the very last thing that I will say about mat is that in the myth of the creation of Egypt, obviously everything, the deity created everything from water. And you can actually see, if you sit by the Nile, you can see like how little islands, mostly now they are like debris and rubbish and dead plants, but little islands emerge and float away, and emerge and are submerged. So this is how the world was created. There was water, and then an island or islands emerged, and they had papyri on them, and they had two creatures. One was the god Tahut, Hermes later, of course, who is represented with the head of an ibis, and he is the bringer of language, technology, science to mankind. And right next to him is his consort, and she is Mat. And Mat stands next to him, her arm, as in typical ancient Egyptian fashion, around his shoulder, and she is ethics. She is harmony, she is balance, and she's always with him, always with the god of technology. Finally, again, harking back to what has been said about what we can do and whether there is anything we can do. And this is, as we were talking together after the event yesterday, I was saying how troubled I was by the idea that one has to absent oneself a little bit from the barrage of news all the time, the scrolling, the knowing what is going on, in order to get some, not exactly peace, but just quietness from which to try to work. And that it seemed to me, has seemed to me, like wrong, really, almost wrong, to back off from everything that's happening for long enough to try and create a few sentences, because in the end, what's the value of these sentences? Are these sentences going to stop a child in Gaza being murdered right now? They're not. But that doesn't go anywhere. That thought, that feeling doesn't go anywhere. The one that does go somewhere is the Mahat idea, and ideas which have been expressed here in these sessions, of what is it that one can do. And what Mahat says is that what you're trying to do is to keep evil and good in balance, to keep a certain harmony in the world. You're not trying to defeat evil, you probably never can, but to at least achieve some kind of balance. And what you do that is by throwing good deeds into the scales on the side of good. Now, by that vision, by that reckoning, whatever you do, however small it is, counts, because it goes into the scales along with the lots of other small and big good deeds that other people are doing. And so this is where I am able to come to rest on an idea that is more than 4,000 years old. Thank you.
Yeah.
Veronica, do you want to say something in response?
Yes.
Really?
No.
Okay.
You.
I was going Pankaj after Ahdaf spoke about technology and ethics, and Veronique spoke about cruelty. I was thinking about what I believe to be another form of imperialism that we are witnessing today, that has no need for an army to invade a country, because it works through different means. And I was realizing all this, I'm talking about what we may call techno-imperialism, which takes the form today of a very perverse alliance between the autocrats, such as Trump, such as Milei, and the plutocrats, the tech plutocrats, such as Musk or Peter Thiel or Zuckerberg. This is a very perverse alliance because they have found the perfect match for each other's ambitions. The autocrats want a confused society that doesn't know the difference between the truth and distortions or post-truths or lies or misinformation. And the plutocrats want deregulation. And in exchange of deregulation, so they can do whatever they like, they can offer a confused citizen. They can offer confusion and distortion and the inability to tell the truth from what it's not. What this has created, bizarrely, in our world is an inability to imagine the other. We have been closed, or rather trapped in bubbles of information and meaning that make it impossible for each one of us to see the world of the other, or to see the world as the other sees it. And when we are unable to imagine the world through the eyes of another, we are unable to negotiate, to come to agreements, and we are prevented from basic notions of empathy and even morality. There was this Hong Kong philosopher that I found the other day, Yan Wei-shun, who had extraordinary ideas about the dangers of artificial intelligence. He said artificial intelligence can be an imperialist project. Artificial intelligence can have very dark negative effects on how we behave as citizens in a democracy. Artificial intelligence can be an agent of progress and satisfactions, but also incredibly dangerous for a democracy and for individual citizens. And I was so happy to have found this philosopher until I realized that he was an invention of artificial intelligence. He had been created by an Italian philosopher, Andrea Colamedici, using ChatGPT and Anthropic in some sort of perverse experiment that made me think of a short story by Borges, in which a man is obsessed with dreaming somebody else so neatly, so completely, that they would force them into existence. And but still, the question remains, can we think about these new technological developments that have changed the way we imagine others and changed the way we behave as citizens? Can we think about that projects being pushed by the Trumps and Musks of the world as a new form of imperialism? I'd like to put that on the table, and so you discuss.
I was thinking that maybe it could be useful to go beyond the idea of neoliberal morality and trying to rethink how imperialism is rebranded now through new forms of colonization of everyday life. For example, through debt, because at least in Argentina nowadays, the majority of the population is taking debt in order to live. So you take debt in order to buy food, medicines, or to pay the rent. So I think that is not that the people is spontaneously neoliberal, rather that they are organized through financial technologies that oblige you to become an entrepreneur in the midst of the dramatic situation of dispossession. So I think that this double bind of becoming an entrepreneur in the midst of nothing, without capital, and also as the only possibility to survive in the midst of the dispossession process, and at the same time call that an active subjectivation that you have to develop in order to survive, is very much connected with this idea of fascism as a process, or fascisation from below, that you are obliged to compete in non-neoliberal conditions. And this is the way that I think that imperialism is also rebranding the way of recolonization everyday life. So it is at the same time this no need in one moment of classical invasion, and at the same time they do it, but how they have been deployed other means of recolonization that I think it's very material and very ground-rooted. So you find these forms of, living your life in the midst of this impoverishment, but at the same time having to develop this entrepreneurial subjectivity.
I would also, like to say that the degree to which we are complicit in this kind of imperialistic or fascistic mentality, as a writer, the expectations on you to be an entrepreneur and to be out there and brand yourself, to promote yourself, and to persuade people who come to your talks to buy your books is intolerable. And it is something that we all accede to, sometimes happily.
Do you know Garcia Marquez used to complain when he was asked by his publishers to go on book tours and give interviews? He used to say, "Well, you didn't help me write the book. Why should I help you sell it?"
That's right. I'm going to steal that.
Bravo. Thank you so much for this.
But I suppose what I'm trying to say is that, there was a time, and one can perhaps date it quite precisely. Carmela, mentioned the 1990s, where we did really break free from certain ethical modes of existence. Adaf described, using two periods from Egyptian history. And we all, for want of a better word, became, in the most sort of, silliest way possible, we became Americans. We became Americans in the sense of, wanting to be with the winners of history. I think that was the big moral shift, that we decided to break with, our destiny as the losers. And we decided that there was shame in being the losers, instead of, the kind of joy that you want, that you don't have these big responsibilities of making the world or making the modern world. But that we wanted to stand with the winners, and I think, in many ways we became victims of this particular morality that you can also be the entrepreneur, the kind of mentality that is now plunging millions of people into debt. By the way, in India, you have a similar situation, where you are now encouraged to be an entrepreneur by gambling on the stock market.
Yeah, exactly.
So there are literally, it's very underreported, there are literally tens of millions of people right now, young people, who with very small amounts of money, people are borrowing money to gamble on the stock market. And this is really quite extraordinary, and it just testifies to the extent to which this kind of imperialism has been internalized, and that we are all, in a way, casualties of it. And it's just the insidiousness of it is quite striking. And it's only now, in the time of global crisis, and perhaps this is why these kinds of events are important, to kind of really precisely identify the insidiousness of the enemy. It's within us. It's very deep within us. But anyway, time to open up to questions.
Just a comment about that.
Yeah.
That I was thinking that how to have a non-moralistic approach, in particular when we are talking about young people, because in Argentina, for example, the government is targeting young male as a sort of strategy of masculinization of the idea of financial risk. So your masculinity will be proof with this idea of financial risk. We are not able to offer you nothing about housing, rights, work, but we are offering you the forms of financial risk as a way to prove your masculinity. So it is really at the same time that the precariousness to young people is a real threat, and that they are interpolated in this idea of masculinization of the financial risk. So it is really hard for them to resist that.
Exactly, yeah. And also the kind of hierarchy what I was saying earlier about when imperialism started to arrive in these societies of India, it brought with it a whole series of hierarchical divisions, you know, and prejudices. So masculinity is superior to femininity. That was the, you know, assumption, the main assumption behind imperialism, which a lot of people internalized, and that's what we're still working with. You know, it's like this is the real thing. The other thing is synonymous with weakness, shame, all these things that we need to avoid. But anyway, questions.
I talked too much today. There's one back there as well.
Never enough.
Yes, my question is about these types of anti-imperialism discourses, which by over-focusing on the United States imperialism, they kind of tend to justify other countries' imperialism or other authoritarian regimes, and recently in the cases of, I don't know, of Ukraine, of Syria, I don't know, Hong Kong, I mean, there have been very recent cases that, and a lot of debates that, for me, show that this is a question that is quite contemporary, right? And especially in a world where supposedly the United States, it will not be what once was, right? And it will not be there in many parts of the world, supposedly. And you will have other countries who may engage in this kind of imperialism practices, right? I don't know, for example, the case of the United Arab Emirates supporting the rapid support forces in Sudan. Is this maybe a case of imperialism or not so much? I mean, because they are so new and it's a kind of a new world, I asked this question.
I would just like to say that I quite agree. After the Venezuelan invasion of the U.S. on January the 3rd, and after the extraction of Nicolás Maduro, I could safely say two things. One, there is one less dictatorship in the world. Maduro effectively was led a corrupt government which violated human rights and had political prisoners and tortured and trafficked with drugs, etc. But the way it was done, through the violation of every legal principle that had held our world together since 1945, through the disrespect of international law, of also of human rights, because of the consequences that might have had, and anyway, the installation of another kind of autocracy, much more acceptable to the US. When that happened, one of the things I immediately thought was our world is more dangerous now than 2 years ago. Why? Because there are people listening and watching how this evolves. Who are those people? Putin's Russia, who feels enabled in their invasion of Ukraine by this by this complete disregard of international law and of the institutions that we have created since 1945, and also China. So yes, I agree. There are other dangers, imperialist dangers going on in the world, and they should be part of every discussion.
I would also insist on a more precise definition of imperialism. I think the UAE's intervention in Sudan and elsewhere, I think it's the intervention of a reckless regime that has too much money and suddenly has too many grand ideas about what it can do, what can achieve in foreign places. Likewise, I think with China or with India, I mean, I myself have written about using the phrase internal colonialism about India's attitude towards its border states, where the northeastern states, Kashmir, even forest-dwelling communities in central India, that is a case of internal colonialism. That's a case of internal. So I've written about Tibet and Chinese policies there, in Hong Kong. So it's not as if we are obsessed with the United States, but one has to recognize that the United States is the major historical actor. It's not China that is fighting wars in different parts of the world today or has military bases around the world today. It's not India. It's we still have. If you're talking a lot about the United States, it's because it has a big presence in Latin America. Historically, that's been the relationship, and with it, the United Kingdom. These are the primary, makers of the modern world, such as it is.
I think it.
My question is about the word fascism. As you know, Veronica, very well, for the last 10 years I've been using this word, and I'm having very heated discussions, especially with Europeans, particularly Germans. They're quite emotional about the word. After 10 years, I decided that whenever I'm asked, why do you call it fascism, I answer back, why don't you? Because I think two reasons. One, in cities, political reason, they still believe in this Cold War lie that if there is free market economy, there cannot be fascism. That can only come from socialism. And the more emotional reason is denial, because people feel helpless, because once you call it fascism, you have to do something about it, and people are not ready for that. What's your answer? And also, are we really sure that it's coming from the bottom? I've been saying that for a few years. But now I think it is more the power of today's fascism comes from the cloud-like aspect of it. It's everywhereness and nowhereness, so to speak. So I call it cloud fascism. I am not sure about the bottom, coming up from the bottom thing. And Ahtaf, I love this idea of middle kingdom. Actually, a stranger comes into town and the constitution comes from him. So I was thinking perhaps the new constitution of Europe, this is an idea, this is a fantasy rather, to think about. The new constitution of Europe should be written by refugees, perhaps. But yeah. Shall we think about that? What would you say?
No, I have nothing. I mean, I agree. You go ahead with the fashion question.
No, I love your phrase, and I was talking to different friends in Argentina about when you call it fascism, you have to do it something, because it's really, I think, what is at stake when you use that concept. But about the from below, for me, it's something important to avoid to say, well, now the people became fascist. That is, I think, it's a very lazy explanation. And this idea of what are the subjects that are guilty of what is happening. So I am trying to deplace that idea of guilty, but also that idea of now the people are fascists, and they are like this everywhere, trying to think in the materiality of devices that are not for me, the cloud is too abstract.
Yeah.
I am more interested how the cloud hit the ground.
Yeah.
And how these platforms, these financial devices, are reorganizing concrete everyday life. So I'm very much interested in how we can research and analyze how financial technologies are not neutral technologies. They produce political subjectivity. So I think that in our countries, maybe 2 decades ago, some more progressive government, they said, well, all the population must be bankerized. It was like a promise of modernization that they said, if we do that, it will be with a progressive orientation. But that capillarity of financial technologies produce political subjectivity. And now this is the political subjectivity that is completely against, for example, social rights, because the financial technology says you are entrepreneur, not a subject of rights. And for example, in Argentina, all the discussion about inflation, it is very much organized through the idea that the inflation is produced because of social rights. So I'm very much interested when I'm talking about from below, not in a guilty perspective, rather in a way that how it is produced, manufactured, this political subjectivity that is all the time obliged to produce the survival through financial devices, and how those financial devices are the way that the abstract capital hit the ground.
Harry, do we have time for one more question? Jose?
No, from the communication across from what Juan Gabriel was saying about the consistency, I mean, the change in the invasions, when we are happy with Pedro Sanchez saying no to the war in Gaza, but he insists, I said no to the Russian war of Ukraine, I said no to the Israeli war in Gaza, I said no to the US war in Venezuela, and now I've said no to the war Israeli and US and Iran. And it's very important that we do not begin. I understand that the whole system, the whole principles of international law were used hypocritically in the past by the superpowers. We know that. But the fact is that once the superpower says, I can do whatever I want, and I don't care about international law anymore, of course it's simply, it's the end, it's the war of all against all, and anybody. So then the United Arab Emirates will do it there, and Congo will do it there, and Brazil may do it somewhere else. So it is the question then, I think that we need some consistency on these principles, not because the US is the worst, the worst empire because it's the most powerful, but we have to be careful to maintain some principles that we are consistent with them. And I don't know how we can do it. I mean, when we said precisely on the question of Europe, and this is the problem of Europe, right? They were universalists when they were, in the name of empire, they were universalists now. And now that they could do it precisely in the name of the refugees, everywhere, they don't do it. So now is the time for the Europeans to be universalists without power, but they are not doing it. And so we have to grapple with this question of how the weak are going to unite to put some brakes on these powers, whether it is from finance, whether it is precise, all this, the autocracy Inc. and the plutocracy Inc. and has to be stopped. And only by all the weaks uniting can be done. And so, you know, I don't know.
But I suppose also being aware of the sinister, insidious ways in which these imperialistic modes work in our inner lives, and the way they shape political imaginations, moral imaginations. So it's not only countries that have to insist on certain ethical norms and laws, but also as individuals. to see ourselves as vulnerable, fragile beings who are, in a way, at all times being invaded, being remade by these psychologies of imperialism and fascism.
But you know, not to be a naysayer or a bringer of dark things, but I don't know what to do. I'll just raise my voice. But what ultimately troubles me is that even if everybody in the world shook off, not everybody in the world, everybody, you know, like in this room and similar, shook off, you know, whatever nasty neoliberal imperialist is sort of lodged within us, and we attained, like, you know, full knowledge and insight and so on. As long as finance and weapons and commerce are in others, I mean, it's not going to make any difference. So that's what I meant when I said that the idea of math helps me, because it means that what the Native Americans are doing, what we are doing, what the mothers of the Plaza Mayor are doing can all be thrown into that side of the scale. But in the end, whoever has the weapons, at least as things stand, how do you move from 1 million people marching in London and people marching in Japan and us talking here and all that? How do you move from that to the political decision to, to behave, to stop killing people? And that is the gap that I cannot see how it is to be bridged. And if it is not to be bridged, then there isn't much point, really. I mean, there is a point in living the good life and being a good person and speaking with people that, but what difference would it make to the world, to the people who are being ground down, who are being killed, who are expendable in the system as it is now and as it looks like it's going to develop more and more into being? I just threw this out as something to be considered because I'm sure that we're all thinking it, but it's dark.
I think on that challenging note, unfortunately, we are over time, but we have to end. But I think it's good to end on this note because it gives us the opportunity to reflect on this question overnight and come up with some brilliant answers tomorrow. Thank you very much. Thank you.